Summer 1940. The United Kingdom is gripped by the growing fear of a German invasion. France has collapsed, and a combined German attack by air and sea on the British Isles seems only moments away. As both Britain and Germany rush to prepare, their air forces fight for dominance over the skies above Britain. For Germany, securing victory in this aerial battle is essential before attempting an amphibious invasion. But even if they gain control of the skies, would they really be able to invade Great Britain? By June 1940, Britain finds itself in an increasingly dangerous situation. German forces have overwhelmingly defeated France, forcing the evacuation at Dunkirk. On June 10, Norway surrenders following a German amphibious assault, and by June 30, Germany has occupied the Channel Islands, a part of British sovereign territory. Before the war, Britain had never expected to face a reality in which German-controlled land stretched from Norway all the way down to the Spanish border. In June, Britain's home forces consist of 15 infantry divisions and 1 armored division, with most units under strength and lacking proper training. More troops arrive through evacuations, the Commonwealth, and rapid recruitment. But there still isn't enough equipment to supply everyone. British forces move quickly to construct long lines of pillboxes, mortar positions, and fortified buildings across the country, particularly along the coastal crust and the inland general headquarters lines. They also introduce more unusual defenses, including the flame fugace, barrels of napalm designed to be ignited against invading troops. Specially prepared, stay-behind guerrilla units are expected to strike vulnerable German supply routes after any invasion begins. At the same time, a massive recruitment campaign is launched for the newly formed local defense volunteers. Within just 6 days of its creation in May, 250,000 men outside the normal conscription age have enlisted. Yet with only 70,000 rifles available, they are prepared to fight using whatever they can find, could be usefully supplemented by a packet of pepper to interfere with the vision of any persistent, unwelcome visitor. British fears are driven largely by an overestimation of German strength, especially when it comes to tanks, mechanization, and airborne forces. Paratroopers, in particular, make the English Channel seem almost useless as a defensive barrier. A June 1940 government pamphlet warns, "Remember that if parachutists come, they will not be feeling at all brave. They will want you to give them food, means of transport, and maps. Do not give any German anything. Do not tell him anything. Hide your food and your bicycles. Hide your maps. See that the enemy gets no petrol." To Britain's leaders, Germany's campaign to dominate Europe appears to be succeeding, and they believe Britain is the next target. We may therefore be sure there is a plan, perhaps built up over years, for destroying Great Britain, which, after all, has the honor to be main and foremost enemy. But Adolf Hitler has no clear strategy for defeating Britain. A Kriegsmarine report from November 1939 considered an invasion of East Anglia, but expressed little confidence in its chances. In early July, Hitler tells his generals that he still believes Britain will eventually seek peace, astonished us by speaking with admiration of the British Empire. He said that all he wanted from Britain was that she should acknowledge Germany's position on the continent. He concluded by saying that his aim was to make peace with Britain on a basis that she would regard as compatible with her honor to accept. However, on July 16, with RAF bombers now carrying out strikes against German targets across Europe, Hitler orders preparations for Operation Sea Lion, though his wording remains cautious. Since England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, shows no signs of being ready to come to an understanding, I have decided to prepare a landing operation against England and, if necessary, to carry it out. The Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine immediately begin working on an invasion plan. But each branch has its own priorities and very different expectations. The Army supports a surprise invasion across a wide front, involving as many as 40 divisions, backed by tanks. One tactical assessment compares the operation to a massive river crossing, where aggressive leadership is considered the key to success It is assumed that the battle is conducted in the manner of an attack across a river, but that no fire protection can be provided from the jumping offshore. Alle Vergeren Nachvorn. Ihr Beispiel entscheidet. All leaders need to be in front. Their example decides. The Navy strongly disagrees, arguing that such a plan is simply impossible. The Navy argues they simply do not have enough transport capacity to carry 40 divisions, and instead pushes for a smaller, more concentrated assault that would better focus available resources while reducing the threat posed by the far stronger Royal Navy. General Halder reacts with fury. I utterly reject the Navy's proposal. From the point of view of the Army, I regard the proposal as complete suicide. I might as well put the landed troops straight through the sausage machine. The final plan becomes a compromise. The invasion force is reduced to 13 divisions, around 90,000 men, landing at 3 main locations protected from the Royal Navy by extensive minefields. Backed by paratrooper drops, German troops are expected to secure a line stretching from Gravesend to Warsash. If that succeeds, another force would come ashore in Dorset and advance toward Bristol. As the invasion grows to around 260,000 German troops, they would push forward to a new line running from Gloucester to Maldon, surrounding London. German planners believed that threatening the capital would force Britain to surrender, just as France had done. Yet the plan is filled with serious weaknesses. Achieving surprise is impossible because changing tides along the landing beaches would force the invasion waves to arrive at different times. The 12-hour gap between the first 2 assault waves would give British defenders and the Royal Navy valuable time to isolate the beachheads or launch powerful counterattacks. Germany also lacks a dedicated marine infantry, has very little experience with amphibious operations, and possesses almost no specialized landing equipment, especially landing craft. Although a few prototype landing craft are under development, the Kriegsmarine is forced to requisition 2,400 continental river barges to cover a shipping shortfall of 1.35 million tons. Some barges would even have to be welded together just to survive the journey across the channel, while many would end up permanently stranded once they reach the beaches. Beyond the weaknesses of the invasion plan and the shortage of shipping, Germany faces another major obstacle: the Royal Air Force. Hitler therefore orders Luftwaffe Chief Hermann Göring to gain air superiority over southern England before launching the planned invasion in late September. The RAF has already been heavily battered during the Battle of France, losing 1,500 personnel, including 300 pilots, along with 950 aircraft. The Luftwaffe suffers around 3,600 killed or missing and loses roughly 1,400 aircraft. However, most German losses are bombers and transport planes, while the majority of RAF losses are fighter aircraft, which are essential for Britain's defense. RAF Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding had resisted repeated demands to send additional fighter command squadrons to France after the campaign was clearly lost. But despite preserving aircraft, the average experience level of British pilots remains relatively low. Christoph Bergs. To prepare for any invasion, the Luftwaffe first had to secure air superiority over Britain. As the battle unfolded, both sides quickly discovered that twin-engine fighters like the Bf-110, dive bombers such as the Ju-87, biplanes like the Gloucester Gladiator, and virtually all bomber aircraft were extremely vulnerable. In fact, the RAF's greatest crew losses during the campaign came from bomber command missions flown over Germany. The real contest for air superiority, however, would be decided mainly by the fighters, the Spitfire, the Hurricane, and the Bf-109, that naturally leads to the famous debate, Spitfire or Bf-109. Which aircraft was actually superior? In reality, the two fighters were remarkably evenly matched. Both had limited range, excellent speed, impressive climbing ability, and represented some of the most advanced aviation technology of their era. The Bf-109 held advantages in firepower, initial diving performance, and direct fuel injection. The Spitfire, on the other hand, excelled in sustained turning performance, although it lacked both direct fuel injection and the heavier armament of its German rival. Then, there was the equally important factor of pilot skill and combat tactics. Although the Luftwaffe had suffered significant losses during the campaign in France, its pilots generally entered the Battle of Britain with greater combat experience. They preferred attacking from higher altitude and flew in pairs, known as a rot, which operated within a 4-aircraft swarm formation. Remarkably, this same 2-ship and 4-ship tactical arrangement remains the foundation of many modern air forces today. The RAF, by contrast, continued using the standard 3-aircraft Vic formation. Wingmen focused primarily on maintaining close formation and following the leader, making the formation far less flexible in combat and much slower to react to sudden enemy attacks. Because of these shortcomings, several RAF squadrons eventually began adapting their tactics on their own initiative. Even so, Britain held 3 major advantages. The first, of course, was geography. German fighters had only a limited range, which severely restricted the amount of time they could spend fighting over Britain. British pilots, on the other hand, could land, refuel, rearm, and often be back in the air within half an hour. If they were forced to bail out, they usually came down over friendly territory and, provided they were not injured, could quickly return to combat. German pilots were far less fortunate, as those who parachuted down were typically taken prisoner. The second major British advantage was radar. The chain-home radar network could detect incoming Luftwaffe formations long before they crossed the English Channel, giving the RAF plenty of time to scramble its fighters. Radar formed the backbone of the world's first sophisticated integrated air defense system. Alongside the radar stations were ground observers and filter rooms that rapidly processed incoming reports before passing vital information to anti-aircraft batteries and fighter squadron bases. As a result, the Luftwaffe could never achieve complete surprise. The final advantage was that the Luftwaffe was fighting a type of war it had never been built for. Although German air doctrine placed great emphasis on bombers as the primary means of projecting air power, the Luftwaffe had been designed mainly to support fast-moving campaigns across continental Europe, as demonstrated in Poland and France. Over Britain, however, it found itself engaged in a battle that perhaps no air force in 1940 was truly prepared to win. In July 1940, the Battle of France gives way to the Battle of Britain. The Luftwaffe enters the campaign with roughly 2,200 immediately serviceable aircraft, the majority being bombers and dive bombers, deployed across Luftflotten 2 and 3 opposite the Channel, with Luftflotte 5 based in Norway. Opposing them are around 640 combat-ready RAF aircraft, mainly Hurricanes and Spitfires, organized within the 4 principal fighter command groups. The heaviest attacks are expected to fall on No. 11 Group under the command of New Zealander Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, while the remaining groups stand ready to reinforce when required. From mid-July until August 12, the Luftwaffe begins the Kanalkampf, or Channel Battle. Their objective is to attack British shipping in the English Channel and lure RAF fighters into dangerous dogfights over open water. These early clashes quickly expose flaws in several interwar air combat theories, including the belief that aircraft equipped with rear gunners could consistently defeat single-seat fighters. British Bolton-Paul Defiance, German Ju-87 Stukas, and Bf 110 heavy fighters all suffer heavy losses when confronted by modern fighters. Although the Luftwaffe loses more aircraft than the RAF, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding realizes that matching every German raid aircraft for aircraft would lead to unsustainable casualties. Eventually, British convoys largely abandoned the English Channel, effectively leaving control of that airspace to the Luftwaffe. At first glance, it appears Gring has successfully won the opening phase of the campaign. In reality, however, the RAF steadily recovers and receives a constant stream of new pilots every week, including volunteers from across the Commonwealth, occupied Europe, and the RAF Volunteer Reserve. Even so, pilot quality varies dramatically. Some replacements arrive with as little as 9 hours of flying time in an operational squadron and have never received any aerial combat training. During the second phase of the battle, the Luftwaffe shifts its attention toward Britain's coastal radar stations, RAF airfields, and aircraft factories. Although several radar installations are temporarily knocked out, German reconnaissance struggles to confirm the damage. Because the attacks are not carried out consistently, British repair crews quickly restore most stations to full operation. As the fighting spreads across southern England, Dowding carefully commits only enough fighters to intercept incoming bombers and disrupt their attacks. This cautious strategy convinces the Luftwaffe that fighter command is close to collapse, encouraging Gring to prepare a decisive offensive in mid-August known as Adlerangriff, or Eagle Attack. Between August 13 and August 19, the Luftwaffe launches massive assaults against RAF fighter infrastructure, reaching a peak on August 15 with around 1,800 sorties flown in a single day. The skies above southern England become the scene of relentless daily dogfights as losses continue to mount on both sides. Ammunition shortages often force engagements to be brief, but incredibly intense. Tracers passed above and below, curving downwards and giving the impression of flying in a gigantic cage of gilt wire. I looked for another target, and a Hun passed just to the right of me and slightly above. I raised the nose, and at about 75 yards opened fire. After about 2 or 3 seconds, the steady rhythm of the Hurricane's 8 Browning machine guns turned into a series of feeble clicks. A quick glance in the mirror showed 3 more 109s on my tail, so I flicked the Hurricane on its side, skidding and turning until I was going flat out. The Luftwaffe succeeds in damaging several RAF airfields and ammunition depots, but British repair crews restore most of the destruction with remarkable speed, while the Germans rarely return to strike the same targets a second time. 1 Experimental Formation, Erprobungsgruppe 210, achieves impressive results by using Bf-110s in a ground attack role, but the Luftwaffe remains reluctant to change its tactics. Most Bf-110s continue serving as heavy fighters, where they remain highly vulnerable. Historian Stephen Bungay concludes, had all the crews been retrained to deliver fast, low-level pinpoint attacks in the way that Erprobungs 210 were, Gring would have had a war-winning weapon in his hands. German intelligence also proves unreliable. The Luftwaffe loses around 50 aircraft while attacking airfields that do not belong to fighter command, and its commanders wrongly believe that nearly all RAF strength is concentrated in southern England. On August 15, a force of Heinkel bombers flying from Norway, protected by only a weak fighter escort, launches a raid against northern England, expecting to meet little resistance. Instead, reserve fighters from No. 13 Group intercept the formation and shoot down almost 20% of the attacking bombers. Between August 13 and August 19, the Luftwaffe loses 363 aircraft, either destroyed or damaged from all causes, with bombers making up the majority of those losses. During the same period, the RAF loses 178 aircraft. British pilots are successfully bringing down German bombers, but nearly all British losses are precious fighter aircraft. For the first time, RAF fighter losses exceed replacement rates. Britain's pilots and machines are being pushed to their limits. Yet the Luftwaffe is equally exhausted. Pilot Ulrich Steinhilper flies 7 combat sorties in a single day and later recalls. Although most of us were still not outwardly showing major signs of nerves, arguments were becoming more frequent. Tempers frayed quicker. The strain of unrelenting frontline flying was beginning to show. Despite these losses, combat experience gradually improves Luftwaffe tactics. German pilots begin using diversionary attacks to confuse British radar operators, and by late August, they have developed a much better understanding of the RAF's sector control system. Fighter airfields such as Biggin Hill come under almost daily attack. Squadron leader Deacon Elliott remembers, no sooner had the squadron landed and refueled than the Germans bombed the airfield. This the second time in 2 days running, and the place was a terrible shambles. 29 killed yesterday, another 7 today. The RAF still possesses more qualified pilots than available aircraft, but those numbers continue to shrink, falling from around 1,400 pilots in July to roughly 1,000 by the end of August. At the same time, Czechoslovakian and Polish pilots based in Britain are finally brought fully into the fight, despite Dowding's earlier concerns that language barriers might create operational problems. The growing losses also spark strategic disagreements among RAF commanders. No. 12 Group Commander Trafford Leigh-Mallory, strongly supported by fighter ace Douglas Bader, argues that large big-wing formations are the best way to defeat German bomber raids. Dowding and Keith Park disagree, believing that smaller, rapidly launched interceptions are far more effective while also preserving Britain's limited strength. Park points out that assembling a big wing simply takes too long, especially for No. 11 Group, which often has only a few minutes to respond before German bombers reach their targets. In practice, No. 12 Group's big wing experiments produce only limited success, yet the so-called big wing controversy continues to divide RAF leadership throughout the remainder of the Battle of Britain and for years afterward. Meanwhile, in ports across German-occupied Europe, the invasion fleet steadily gathers. On September 7, British commanders issue Cromwell, the codeword warning that a German invasion may be imminent. Their decision is influenced by several developments. On the very same day, the Luftwaffe changes strategy, shifting its attacks away from RAF airfields and concentrating instead on London. Some historians argue this decision is driven by Hitler's anger over an RAF bombing raid on Berlin, itself carried out in retaliation for an earlier, and probably accidental, German bombing of London. Others believe Gring hopes the attacks on the capital will force the RAF into one final decisive battle while also breaking British civilian morale before an amphibious invasion begins. Instead, the decision gives the RAF exactly the breathing space it desperately needs. Attacks against fighter command airfields decline sharply, and although fighter losses continue, the repair and replacement system finally has time to recover. Keith Park later recalls, "On the late evening of 7 September, I flew over London. And I can assure you that the east end of London and the Thames estuary were a grim sight. However, though I felt very angry, I said, 'Thank God,' because I realized that the methodical Germans had at last switched their attacks from my vital aerodromes onto cities." The battle reaches another climax on September 15, when two enormous daylight raids involving around 250 bombers and more than 300 Bf 109 fighters clash with roughly 300 RAF fighters. By now, the Bf 109s are forced into much closer escort duties, limiting their tactical freedom and leaving them far more vulnerable than before. The day's fighting costs the Luftwaffe 80 aircraft, including 23 Bf 109s, while the RAF loses 35 fighters. Just 2 days later, Hitler postpones the invasion of Britain indefinitely. Fierce air battles continue through October, but German bombers increasingly shift to the relative safety of nighttime bombing, sacrificing accuracy for survival. By October 31, Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding officially considers the Battle of Britain to be over. RAF Fighter Command suffers the loss of 449 pilots killed, while around 1,500 aircraft are either damaged or destroyed. The Luftwaffe loses approximately 2,500 personnel killed, another 900 taken prisoner, and nearly 2,800 aircraft damaged or destroyed. Most German aircraft losses are bombers, whose larger crews account for the significantly higher casualty figures. German bombing raids also claim the lives of roughly 23,000 British civilians. The Luftwaffe's defeat can be traced to several factors, including Britain's radar network, poor German intelligence, and the tactical disadvantages faced by German pilots, who were forced to fight over enemy territory. It was also engaged in a campaign for which it had never truly been designed. Although the Luftwaffe had been influenced by interwar theories of strategic bombing, financial limitations and the dominant position of the German army meant that it evolved primarily as a force intended to support ground offensives with light and dive bombers. These aircraft simply lacked the striking power needed to carry out an independent air campaign. At the same time, pre-war ideas comparing air combat to naval warfare encouraged investment in costly turret-equipped heavy fighters. As a result, Germany failed to build enough single-engine fighters, the very aircraft that ultimately proved decisive during the Battle of Britain. Historian Jens Wehner summarizes the problem. Luftwaffe flew many inefficient airplanes like bombers or Zerstrer into battle. The existing aerial armament advantage in 1940 remained almost inconsequential. To focus on fighter production, Luftwaffe leadership would have to abandon their doctrine. But this was never considered, because the German victories of 1939–40 obscured the weakness of the German doctrine. On the strategic level, both Luftwaffe commanders and German intelligence are poorly prepared for the challenge they face. During combined air-ground campaigns, it is often enough to strike targets near the front line only once. The Battle of Britain, however, demands repeated and carefully coordinated attacks against RAF infrastructure. Germany fails to do this consistently, allowing much of the damage it inflicts to remain only temporary. By contrast, the RAF has been specifically built to defend British airspace against strategic bombing. Former Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain deserves some credit for this achievement. Driven partly by financial realities, he prioritizes funding for single-seat fighters such as the Spitfire, while others, including Winston Churchill, favor bombers or heavy fighters. The British government also invests heavily in radar and the sophisticated command and control network that forms the backbone of RAF Fighter Command. Historian John Ray highlights Britain's preparedness. If the David and Goliath analogy is accepted, the former was better prepared and the latter less fearsome than customarily believed. It is often claimed that victory in the Battle of Britain prevented a German invasion and saved Britain from likely defeat. But that conclusion remains the subject of debate. So, did Operation Sea Lion ever have a realistic chance of succeeding? The truth is that no one can know exactly what might have happened if Britain had lost the Battle of Britain. Some historians argue that, had the full Sea Lion invasion force successfully landed, Germany might have achieved its immediate military objectives, although whether Britain would have surrendered remains highly uncertain. Even so, winning the air battle during August and September would not automatically have guaranteed a successful invasion. For one thing, there were only 7 suitable tidal days during those 2 months for launching such a massive amphibious assault. That meant the Luftwaffe would have been forced to maintain air superiority over southern England for an extended period, further exhausting its already overstretched forces. With RAF squadrons able to withdraw to airfields beyond German fighter range and then return to battle, maintaining that dominance would have been extremely difficult. The Royal Navy's home fleet also remained perhaps the greatest obstacle. Lacking sufficient torpedo bombers, the Luftwaffe was unlikely to destroy the fleet from the air. Meanwhile, the Kriegsmarine was still recovering from heavy losses suffered during the Norwegian campaign, and simply did not possess enough major warships to challenge the Royal Navy in the English Channel. British naval forces would probably have cleared the German minefields within days, reopening access to the invasion's vulnerable supply routes. Although such an operation would almost certainly have cost the Royal Navy valuable ships, preventing, or even seriously disrupting, Operation Sea Lion would have more than justified those sacrifices. German planning itself also remained deeply flawed. German planners expected to transport roughly 100,000 troops in the first 2 assault waves using around 2,000 canal barges. By comparison, during Operation Overlord in 1944, the Allies required nearly 4,000 purpose-built landing craft to carry 132,000 soldiers across the Channel. Unlike the Germans in 1940, the Allies benefited from years of hard-earned experience gained through both successful and unsuccessful amphibious operations in France, the Mediterranean, and the Pacific. Germany had no comparable experience to draw upon. Cooperation between the German armed services, essential for any amphibious invasion, was also weakened by rivalry between the branches and by Hitler's preference for meeting commanders individually rather than encouraging joint planning. It is also possible that some senior officers doubted the chances of Operation Sea Lion from the very beginning, but were unwilling to openly challenge Hitler's directive. Vice Admiral Kurt Amann later reflected, "When the time came for the final decision, none of the responsible personalities was ready, despite his knowledge of the weighty matters at stake, to take a firm stand against the operation." All, however, were inwardly relieved to be able to find, in the lack of air mastery, a sound argument which would openly justify them in abandoning the operation. Even if Germany had been capable of invading Britain, another important question remains: would it actually have gone through with it? Occupying Britain, with no guarantee that the campaign would be either quick or straightforward, would have tied down enormous resources at exactly the moment Hitler was turning his attention toward the east. From the German point of view, conquering Britain was never an essential requirement before attacking the Soviet Union. In fact, it may even have delayed those plans. By December 1940, Hitler is already preparing for war against the Soviets, and unlike the cautious wording of Directive No. 16 concerning Britain, Directive No. 21 leaves no room for hesitation. The German Wehrmacht must be prepared to crush Soviet Russia in a quick campaign, even before the conclusion of the war against England. For this purpose, the army will have to employ all available units. As 1941 approaches, Britain remains firmly in the war. Meanwhile, Hitler's growing obsession with defeating the Soviet Union pushes Germany toward a massive escalation of the conflict, ultimately drawing the country into the very two-front war it had worked so hard to avoid. The Battle of Britain is often remembered, especially in Britain, as the story of the few, a small group of fighter pilots standing alone against the might of the Luftwaffe. Yet that familiar narrative often overlooks the countless others whose contributions were just as vital: bomber crews, coastal command, the observer corps, radar operators, plotting room staff, ground crews, repair teams, anti-aircraft gunners, air raid wardens, and many more. If you'd like to learn more about these people on the ground, along with Britain's remarkable radar network and the sophisticated interception system that helped defend the country, be sure to watch Real Engineering's Battle of Britain documentary series. Featuring cutting-edge 3D animations and first-hand historical accounts, the series explores many fascinating aspects of the battle that are often overlooked. And if you're interested in the enormous logistical challenge behind the Second World War's largest amphibious invasion, and why it succeeded while Operation Sea Lion never truly had the same chance, you should also check out Real Engineering's Logistics of D-Day series. So, where can you watch both Battle of Britain and Logistics of D-Day? They're available on Nebula, the streaming platform we're building alongside other creators, where we don't have to worry about YouTube's ever-changing algorithm or advertising restrictions. On Nebula, you'll find exclusive productions such as Battle of Britain, Logistics of D-Day, Our 16 Days in Berlin, and Rhineland 45 documentary series. All available in stunning 4K resolution and ready to watch on your smart TV, phone, or other devices. If you sign up at nebula.tv/realtimehistory, you can get a full year of Nebula for just $30. Along with exclusive documentaries, you'll also get our regular videos ad-free and before they're released on YouTube. That includes Real Engineering's in-depth documentary on the Spitfire. Once again, visit nebula.tv/realtimehistory to get a full year for just $30 while helping support this channel. As always, you'll find every source we used linked in the video description below. If you'd like to learn more about the events leading up to the Battle of Britain, don't forget to watch our video covering the Battle of France. And if you're watching on Patreon or Nebula, thank you very much for your continued support. I'm Jesse Alexander, and this has been a production of Real Time History, the only history channel that's still stockpiling pepper for persistent, unwelcome visitors.